Good afternoon, everybody. You're welcome this afternoon. We are going to start now a conversation with Mikal Anderson. He's African American, North American, and he came here to show his content that is geared towards diversity, equality, inclusion. He has a company called, and we are going to have them feel free when he starts talking about his work to ask for clarifications, exchange ideas, and it's going to be very open for conversation.
Botaji, and thank you. Obrigado. So, hello, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Mikal Anderson. I am originally from Philadelphia in the United States, and I now split my time between three different cities, having built a consulting practice that really focuses on diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so those spaces are Washington, D.C., New Orleans, Louisiana, and also Houston, Texas. So I'm going to start off a little bit about my personal background. As I shared, I'm from Philadelphia, born and raised, the same place that some of you may know in terms of Will Smith, same area. Grew up there. Uh, and I want to talk a little bit more about also my journey into this space, into diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. It started for me at a very young and early age, having grown up in a mixed faith household. My mother is Christian, my father is Muslim. So there was a lot of back and forth in terms of inclusion and thinking about cultural diversity, even at the dinner table, what I practice, et cetera. And also come from a multicultural and also, when I say a multiracial family as well, not necessarily, but my immediate household, but there were many people that married into my family from Asia, from Latin America. So I got to see this whole plethora of diversity and see how it's just a beautiful thing. And so what I do now, I'm currently a professor where I teach diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging, and public policy at Tulane University in New Orleans. I'm also a global diversity practitioner and strategist, and so I've had the opportunity to do this work across 5 different continents now. So I've spent time in Asia, particularly in Hong Kong. I've been to Europe, particularly Western Europe, and also the Nordic countries. I've spent time across Africa, South Africa, Ghana, Nigeria, Egypt, where I've done work, parts of Latin America, in particular Colombia and Brazil, and also across the United States. So yes, I see some eyes raised. I've seen this in various contexts. And I would say is that from an international standpoint, diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging, it's diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging from an international standpoint, it needs to be localized. And what I mean by that is local context matters. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. I want to talk a little about that as it relates to Afrofuturism. And we think about Black people. We think about the Black community and people of the Black diaspora. And we think about all of these things that we can imagine in terms of futurism. And we see this in comics, and we see this in the arts, et cetera. But my work is really centered on how do we do this now, right? There's urgency. How do we do this now? How do we center equity? How do we center belonging? How do we center advancement of Black people now? And so I want to talk a little bit about what this looks like in practice. And so for some of you that are also practitioners in the diversity, equity, and belonging space, what this looks like in practice. As I said, corporations, I've worked with government agencies in the United States, I've worked with global think tanks, with nonprofits, with philanthropic organizations, and the work starts with assessment. You have to actually diagnose and assess where you are. That's uncomfortable for some people because when you capture those data through assessment, it also uncovers the problem and what problems may potentially exist, speaking the same language around it. And from there, then assessment. So are we actually employing the right strategies? But I want to talk now a little bit about belonging, what it means to belong. I speak from my perspective as a Black male coming from the United States, and I've been in many spaces where I don't feel that I belong, right? In the workplace, in society, walking down the street when people are grabbing their purses because they see a big Black man, not knowing that I'm actually an intellectual as well. And so I think that for us, we have to think about what is a call to action for all of us to create spaces of belonging in our respective organizations and also in our communities. It's not just a top-down approach from policymakers. It's also what are we doing? How are we creating these connections across the diaspora? How are we learning from one another? How are we informing other people about our experiences? That's really important. And so a key question I want to raise to the audience today is how do we advance Black consciousness? How do we advance Black people? And how do we advance the Black experience across multinational contexts? And I would say, arguably, for me, one is cross-cultural exchange. It's events like this. It's how are we making connections with people that look like us and people that don't look like us, but how are we making these connections in an intentional way? That's one. I would say additionally is thinking about how do we cultivate a sense of entrepreneurship, and I love the work that Vale do Dente does, right? How are we cultivating and building the next generation of entrepreneurs? Because that leads to financial freedom, right? And then lastly, I would say is thinking about is how are we informing those that are in powerful decisions in the decision-making processes, right? So what does it mean to create these channels for us to be able to engage with those people? So I want to actually open up the dialogue today, and I want to talk more to the audience, right? I see this as an opportunity for me to learn from you, as potentially you may be able to learn from me. And one of the things that I would like to open up to you all is thinking about the context even here in Brazil. For those, and I'm sorry. Yes. It's good? Okay. So for those of you in the audience, I would love to learn more about what the Black experience is like here in Brazil. If anyone's open to sharing.
Gente, sintam-se à vontade. Quem quiser fazer pergunta, interagir, tá? Tem um microfone aqui.
I see some size. Yeah.
Boa tarde.
Good afternoon. My name is Nana Neves. I come from TV Pelourinho, Pelourinho TV station. I'm going to speak about my own experience. I don't know if it fits other women, if it's suitable for other women, but for a long time, I couldn't fit in anything because I used to hear from another woman that I wasn't white enough to be white, or black enough to be black, or dark skinned enough to be black. And I didn't reside in any tribes to be indigenous. I was in a nowhere type of space. And for a long time, and for a lot of people, who not belonging, not being anywhere, not being dark skinned, when you don't have physical traits that readily identify you as a white phenotype or black phenotype or indigenous phenotype. And my experience, my personal experience was that I have my grandmother indigenous background. So my hair is naturally black, my skin color says that I look very much like my grandmother, and she had indigenous traits. My hair grows like indigenous hair grows because my grandmother used to be that way. So I started to recognize myself in that space when I started to look for my ancestors. And I'm an artist. And when we come to the working space where you have several spaces, several work opportunities. They want your profile, and you need to be tall, and you need to be dark skinned, or you have to be a bit shorter and have light and be light skinned. And I would never fit in anything. And I used to feel in a nowhere type of space. And I don't know if other people feel that way, but in Brazil, they define us as pardos, which is basically a mixed race person. The best translation would be that. And nowadays, I can say that I'm Afro indigenous because my mother is black, and I have grandparents who are indigenous. And I see myself and I understand my space, but when I start talking about that, as a woman who is Afro-Indigenous in a culture where I work with culture, I work with my image. I start to see gazes. I see that people do not understand that space because I usually state that Brazil has been built on the backs of indigenous and black people. There's not only indigenous or black, and by white people as well, of course. There were a few things that happened when Brazil was invaded. So being this Afro-Indigenous woman here and having this exchange is good so that I recognize myself, but it's a gigantic challenge to always explain and look for a space in work or because even for women who are similar to me in terms of skin color and history, they don't recognize me and it's very exhausting to be in this space. But as an Afro-Indigenous person, I bring this experience.
No, thank you for sharing. And there definitely is an onus, and there definitely is a heaviness when you have to educate other people about your experiences. And unfortunately, this is something that Black and brown people have to do all the time, particularly when we are in heterogeneous societies, particularly when we are minorities. We have to tell people about our experiences, right? And there are multiple layers of diversity, right? It's not just around race or ethnicity. You have gender identity, you have sexual orientation, right? You have religious or cultural background. All of these different dimensions of diversity, whether they are seen or not seen, we are having to carry that onus of having to inform people about our experiences, and it's exhausting. But I think one of the things that we can do a better job of, particularly in our community and in the Black community, is to recognize each other for who we are. I think too often, and having, again, been in different spaces, been in different places, in different contexts, right, is that sometimes we polarize ourselves as a community. We think about colorism, and I can tell you we can go down the whole conversation around colorism and affinity towards lighter skin versus darker skin. We do that to ourselves as well, right? We think about where we are originally from. And so it's interesting when I engage in dialogues and conversations with some colleagues from Africa. Some of us will call us, some may say that we are, arguably the lost tribe. We were, part of, our ancestors were part of the transatlantic slave trade, forcibly, removed from our place of origin, our homes, et cetera. But Blackness is not a monolith. We all have unique and different experiences, and we also have to, within the community, within the diaspora, respect that and respect one another. So I understand wholeheartedly what you are saying, and it is an emotional tax of having to inform other people, but if we don't do it, who will? And that's the challenge. And so I often say to people is that keep going, right? Keep going. It's tiring, it's exhausting. Figure out how to take care of your mental well-being and recharge, because what we are seeing right now, and this is me speaking personally in my opinion, what we are seeing right now is a second coming of what I would say are civil rights movements. We are seeing these cultural wars that are emerging across the globe. They're not just in the United States. We're seeing these cultural wars that are emerging. And we're seeing these anti-Black sentiments that are emerging as well. You can look at any type of data out there, and it will show you that life outcomes is connected to skin color, and the darker you are, the lower your life outcomes, whether it be around health, whether it be around education, right? And so we have to really be intentional about how we are combating these anti-Blackness sentiments, but also how we are uplifting one another in the space. So I really want to commend you for sharing your story. I would say keep going, definitely keep going, keep forging ahead, and not be afraid to share your stories, right? So and it takes a lot of courage. It's not easy, but not to be afraid to share your story. Some people might call me a strategic disruptor. I am unapologetic when it comes to diversity, equity, inclusion, belonging. I make people uncomfortable. That is my job. And honestly, if I'm not making you uncomfortable, I'm probably not doing my job well. That's how I view it, because, again, this work is also about giving voice to the voiceless, and I appreciate you elevating your voice in this space. And also, I would just challenge you to continue to elevate your voice. I would challenge you to continue to elevate your story. I would challenge you also to continue to forge ahead because you don't know what type of impact that will make for people that are coming behind you. Anyone else?
Alguém mais, gente?
Entendeu?
Tá.
Hello, good afternoon. My name is Ana Luisa Dias. I am a psychologist. I have this dimension of my experience, but I know that my experience is very unique and peculiar. I am a daughter of a housemaid, and I've always studied in public schools, and I have the opportunities of having different fellowships. I traveled to the United States. I studied it at universities there. I was following a doctoral degree in England, and I chose to be in Brazil and stay in Brazil. But I think it's interesting to share that opportunity, how much of our experience here in Brazil has common elements of being black in Brazil and being a part of the world. But what I think in my experience, my perception is there's always an encountering of a particular space. It is an exhausting experience. Black people in Brazil in different ways, we are always discovering a new space and rediscovering ourselves, and be it for a black person that is going to find out, I'm sorry, I was not speaking right in the microphone. This person is going to find out that he or she is black, 30, 40 years old, be it because they decide to really feel their hair texture, or perhaps women nowadays, 50, 60 years old, they found out what the real hair is like through the experience of younger people in the family. So if we want to talk about Afro-Indigenous person, they are going to have a whole retrieval of their ancestrality and locating, situating themselves in being in that space. And all of that ends up being even more exhausting than having to deal with what they are in certain spaces. And there's another dimension, which is how recent that is in Brazilian history. And I think that's a peculiarity that we need to show, we need to emphasize, so that you may understand we have less than 150 years in which slavery was abolished, during over 3 centuries for our 500 and something years in which enslavement was a legitimate institution in Brazil. If you talk to someone who's 80 years old, this person who was raised by this person, who gave birth to this person, was someone who lived or was educated by someone who was during the slave trade. It was yesterday, and that brings a mark because we are always finding this space, and this space of work for the youngest generations, as we occupy the spaces that were impossible for older generations, is a new space for us. It is a space in which we don't know necessarily how to deal with money, and we are constantly denied. Is this really your space as a psychologist, as an engineer, physician, lawyers? You always have to be, if you are a fantastic professional, you need to show that you are what you claim to be, and having to deal with all of these spaces that are related and dealing with you, you are achieving things from a perspective that was collectively built, but at the same time, you are mediating the world, and this is exhausting. So, having the experience of living in different spaces and considering that being someone who is Brazilian, a black person, an indigenous person, someone who's Afro-Indigenous, the experience of the yellow people, Asian descended people are also marked by their experiences. And we have then these intersectionalities, thinking about the several layers of weight that oftentimes we need to remove individually, weights that have been historically placed upon us, and that's exhaustive. And this is a very important dimension to be attentive and being able to share ways and forms of looking.
No, I think you're right, and it is about how do we think about that? How do we confront those things? The weight, right? The weight that has come from centuries of history, right? We didn't just get to this place. We didn't just arrive here, right? And we have a lot to unpack and to navigate through. I actually want to share with you a strategy or strategies that I use when having these conversations, but also thinking about equity, diversity, inclusion, belonging. And I call it, in my country, we'll call it a KMO framework. It's worked really well for me. And so what we see often in the times, and you're talking about even from a history or historical standpoint, we have to understand the problem. We can't understand the problem if we don't actually understand history and how we got to this point. So really it's digging deeper into that knowledge, and the K is that knowledge domain. Right? And so even if I were to disaggregate or break down the knowledge domain, I look at 3 types of knowledge, right? As a diversity practitioner, I look at conceptual knowledge, I look at procedural knowledge, and I look at metacognitive knowledge. Are we all speaking the same language? Do we understand the concepts? Do we understand what racism and prejudice and bias are? Do we understand what they look like, right? Then the procedural knowledge is that now that I understand these things, how do I apply it to my day-to-day life and to practice? Often we see, to your point, we're talking about, because you're talking also about the interaction between systems, whether it be in education, you're talking about your daughter. Unfortunately, people do not have these skill sets as it relates to addressing historical context, addressing issues around diversity, equity, and inclusion, because they fall flat. They just stop at the knowledge domain and really just the conceptual knowledge. Oh, did we go through a training and did we check the box? Do we actually know the terms? But if you don't know how to apply it, the procedural knowledge, what does that mean? It's not going to change behavior. And then I would say lastly is the metacognitive knowledge, and this is the really hard part about it. How do you look yourself in the mirror and self-assess yourself? Am I acting in an equitable way? Right? And also, how do you share that information with leaders in organizations, in educational systems, in corporations that may not look like you, who need to do that tough self-work, right? I found to be successful is that when you align it to the values of an organization, you align it to their profitability and loss, they then get interested, right? But many will distance themselves from that, but that's the knowledge domain. I would say also is that as we're engaging in this work and we're talking about systemic change, we have to look at motivational factors, right? So let's think about your psychologist, the organizational psychology of it all. And I break down motivation into 2 different ways: utility and attainment. Often what we will see is that people don't find, if people do not find engaging in this work, if talking about race, talking about equity, talking about inclusion, if they don't find it useful in helping them in their day-to-day lives or useful in them achieving their goals in their organizations, they distance themselves and don't do it, right? So it's utility. And then also I would say it's attainment. So the attainment part is that, is this actually going to help me to get to where I want to be? If people cannot make those connections, you will often see them disengage. Right? And then lastly, this is the big piece, and I think it's organizational influences. That's the O, right? And I say the big O and the little O. The little O is, how are you addressing organizational context, right? Or organizational dynamics within an ecosystem, within an organization, within a school, within potentially locus of control. Where it becomes a little bit more complex and more difficult is when there are things that the big O outside of your control. We're talking about socio-political things, right? We're talking about politics, we're talking about policy, right? Because at the end of the day, you may want to push for a more equitable environment for children. You may want to push for a more equitable environment professionally. But if there are social-political things that are happening outside, right, in the broader world and in that particular context that are mitigating those things, they then can also fall flat. And so that's where we have to all be strategists and think about, okay, what are the policy implications and how do we engage with those people that are in decision-making? How do we engage in social-political context so we can drive towards change? How do we mobilize? And I think this is, again, part of this whole dialogue and conversation is how are we building connections? How are we learning from one another? How are we creating cross-cultural exchange of knowledge and of information, right? I challenge, and this is me speaking again, I'm gonna say for myself, but one of the things that really stresses me a little bit is the fact is People in America act like we have it right, and we don't. Sometimes people look to us in America as we have the solutions. We don't. But I think one of the things, and I try and hold myself accountable as an American, is that people do look to us in terms of what we are doing. So, for example, the culture wars that are happening in the United States right now, in Florida and in Texas, the repealing of certain rights for people, for women, for people of color, right? These things are being watched by the international community, and they are taking cue. And I'll say, for example, having recently even spent some time in Germany, there is an alt-right, far-right movement that is anti-immigration, that is anti-black, right? That is anti-everything that is not German. That is literally on the rise. That is almost now 25% of the political party, right? And I'm just using this as an example. And so in engaging with people in that country, the first thing they say is, well, we look to America. Look at what the Americans are doing in Florida. So if they're doing it, then it must be okay, right? So I often, and that's why I try and get in the forefront and working with membership organizations like the National Urban League of the United States, the NAACP, and engaging with leaders from different organizations is because honestly, I feel that there really is, we're at the precipice of, in my opinion, another second coming of civil rights movement, especially for Black people. And are we going to actively engage or are we going to be bystanders? Right? So I appreciate your comment, and I hope that some of the things that I shared, just in terms of some of the strategies I've seen to work, they've really been effective. But I would say is that really knowing your audience, knowing how to engage with them, and being able to break down things in a scientific and discrete way. And I know this, you being a scientist as well, being able to break those things down in a discrete way often leads to progress, right? You see analysis paralysis often in organizations or people that are in decision making because they say, oh, this is too much. This is like, and it is, it's a lot. You're talking about centuries of stuff, right? But I think also is, again, going back to the point, how do we learn from one another? How do we share information? Strategies that we may be using may work well here and vice versa, but how are we actually facilitating that cross-cultural dialogue and exchange, I think is critically important.
Sim.
Tá ligado? Então,
Hence, let me speak Portuguese here. Well, you have asked, what is our experience? And in two important issues that I would like to comment on is the first is related to the history because Brazil organized a campaign in order to share the notion that we don't have a defined race and that we have a mixture of people that no longer may be racially defined, and that would be a strategy to hide racism. So the notion of race and mixed race people was actually a strategy from the Brazilian government in order to hide racism itself uh, within society. So this has to do with our experience as Brazilians, and something else is what I realize in terms of the international community and that have been colonized by the British and Portuguese. I see a pattern, a behavioral pattern in light of the interventions from also coming from France, because these are and Spain, the fourth larger enslaving countries, Angola, Mozambique, Brazil, you see a similarity. The Portuguese colonization strategy of vis-a-vis populations that were being colonized, they have brought a unique experience. And when I see that in the United States and South Africa, you see this radical distinction in a certain sense. And in Brazil, Mozambique, in Angola, there was a notion of assimilation in which you could feel like you belonged to white European society, and at the time you wouldn't belong at all, ever. So Brazil, then we had this notion of assimilation. The notion is that we are about to belong to high society, particularly if you're mixed race, if you're light skinned, as it's been presented by my colleague, but at the same time, you're not going to do that because that is reflected in the data that pardos, mixed race people, and blacks, they have the same, almost the same financial condition. And that brings a little bit of the notion of the Portuguese strategy of bringing closer without having us closer.
You raise some great points. You raised some great points in English. um, I think baseline, and it's interesting because what you're mentioning, what happens in terms of not collecting data around race, I've seen that in other contexts. And even if I take it back to Germany, I spent about a month there a few months ago. And meeting with different leaders there, the first thing they said, well, it's forbidden. And again, to your point, it's an excuse. They said, well, because of the Holocaust and because data was used to actually track different types of people, we forbid it now. So my question then becomes, and what I ask those leaders, and the same thing that you're raising, is, well, how do you address the problem if you don't measure it? If you don't capture data around race, how do you actually uncover racial equity problems so that you can address them? How do you fund initiatives? How are you strategic in actually, putting forth interventions and knowing what people need? I think, and this is an international crisis, I think is that, as it relates to this space, is that people are uncomfortable talking about race. They're uncomfortable talking about it. And particularly those that are in positions of power who may not look like those that are marginalized. They're uncomfortable. There's an uncomfortability talking about race. And we have to talk about race. We have to talk about centering racial equity in this work, right? For me, even when we talk about equity, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, even belonging, I would even put a little R there and say racial equity. Because if we look at racial disparities and how things have been racialized, right? But we look at racial disparities, the evidence becomes glaring and it becomes very evident. And so the easiest way, to your point, to kind of sweep it under the rug is to not capture the data. You want to know why? Because with data comes accountability. And when you have data and then those things are exposed then to those that are in decision-making positions, then the question becomes, well, what are you going to do, right? You're not forced to actually solve the problem or to act if you don't have the information in front of you. And so you see that distancing that happens quite often. And so the question I then also pose, and this is very interesting that you brought this up, is I've made suggestions, and again, I know that you're a researcher as well, is how do we actually lean more into qualitative data and how can we actually build data hubs within our communities that help inform policy, that help inform decision making. So for example, you don't want to capture the data, okay, we're going to do it ourselves. We're going to go and talk to all the people in the community, and we're going to triangulate that information, and we're going to roll this up and share to you, this is what's happening. Here are the experiences. So if you do not want to capture this data, well, here it is for you, right? Now, what are you going to do about it? And so I think that also is a call to action, is how do we mobilize in our communities? How do we capture our own information, and how do we share that information with decision makers?
Hi, Ada. Bem-vindo ao Brasil.
Welcome to Brazil. My name is Luciane Reis.
Quando eu
In my thesis, I talk about the impact of the absence of Black intellectuals in the process of entrepreneurial formation, and I work specifically with economics and management. When you talk about data, for me, it was very interesting because when I started my master's degree at the administration school at UFBA, which is one of the most important one in terms of academic excellence, many people laughed at me when I mentioned that I wanted to study the economical history of Black people. Many people thought it was an absurd. So, what was the path of Black money that I wanted to debate, that I want to talk, how I wanted to do that? And then I challenged myself to study administration. It's a very technical one when you think about profit, market, and I wanted to talk about the history of Black economic from the perspective of the affection and the feelings. So how do we make decision, non-political decision in consumerism spaces? And all of these reads in intellectuals in the administration area and especially Black intellectual in management field. It's fantastic because we have all this fight in the academia because academia says there is no Black intellectuality in the economic area. And here you have a dispute in terms of politics and economic field. And we will talk about this data. My final product is Mercafro, is my final product. And here I make a curatorship of management of produced by Black entrepreneurs. I curate those studies and those initiatives, and then what is going to become info product. When you talk about data, this is important because here in our state, the main institute that is socioeconomic superintendency in this state is a fantastic, Black space. And this state, this is the blackest space, the blackest state in Brazil. They don't have a data, this data, concerning the Black population. We have the academic residency or trainee or internship. We go to the institution and try to understand how it works. I went to this institution which deals with economic data for our state. When we talk with a technician, with the technical people, they say, hey, you don't need to study this because as for Bahia, automatically we understand it's a Black majority. So what was strategic in terms of data production here? First, understand that in our Black diaspora, we have no companies which invest in collecting Black data as for economics. So we are walking through the Black diaspora without not knowing the market, how we impact in world economy, how we impact in local economy, how we impact in our territory. And then we have to think of so many things, but we don't work with this piece of information, which is so important for us to start any debate about innovation, technology, and new models for digital business. Who are we when we're talking about data? Who are we when we confess our numbers? This is interesting what we can get to do. When you talk about connections and network, we can connect even not knowing what we mean strategically to the world. And I'm not thinking, in numbers, in data, economically speaking, who are we? Who are we going to be in this world of technology when we think about money? When we think of capacity of real intervention. So in this sense, I'm saying I'm talking I'm talking a little bit longer, but I was here reading your biography about what to do and your understanding of culture. I would like you to talk a little bit more about this connection of culture and innovation and data production in terms of numbers, which can allow us think about income. Here in Brazil, we use the concept of whiteness of a person who occupies a power space, and they get really bored when we say branquitude or whiteness. So they should go to therapy anyway. I have so many things in my life to deal with, you know. I have to resolve so many years of oppression in the white people. No, I don't have time for this. So I really would like you to bring to us how do you see this connection of Black intellectuality and our themes? To finish, here in Brazil, we have a boom of digital influencers which say, oh, I am a Black person doing this kind of work. And this is enough for me to be.
No, thank you for your comments and also for your question. Data is very important. It's very important. And I appreciate you elevating also, this is really also centered around economic inclusion. Economic inclusion, and I would say also social and economic mobility for Black people. And it needs to be a data-driven conversation, to your point. And so let's even break this down at an economic, if we're looking at economics, let's look at even microeconomics, macroeconomics. Let's talk about even just baseline supply and demand. I think one of the challenges and one of the things that we can do, even in our communities now, is to move more from a supply model to a demand model, and also to benchmark, not necessarily against whiteness, but benchmark against Blackness, right? For so long, whiteness has been the standard. But this is the time we talk about Afrofuturism for us to reimagine what things look like for the Black community. So how are we benchmarking towards Blackness, Black consumption, consumption patterns, et cetera? So for example, and I want to use this, it's a very interesting point because I just had this conversation with a few leaders and across the diaspora, and really thinking about how do we investigate and learn more around the consumption patterns of Black people? How do we capture those data? Because those data will help to inform what type of businesses that we create to support the Black community, right? They will inform, and we capture those data points, they will inform the strategies, the products that we develop, right? So what are those consumption patterns? Too often we're saying, okay, we want to drive towards entrepreneurship, right? And I'm not saying entrepreneurship is very important. And I'll ask even by, a raise of hands, propose that, and I know this might not be in real time, but for a raise of hands, how many wealthy people do you know that work for someone else? Raise your hand if you know wealthy people that work for someone else. Not many, right? If you look at the wealthiest people out here, the wealthiest people in our societies, the wealthiest people in the world, most of them are inventors, they are entrepreneurs, they are people that have built their own thing. They have created something that there was a demand for, and they are created now the supply to open that up and provide it to the market. And so to your point, if we're thinking about building Black business, if we're thinking about Black entrepreneurship, if we're thinking about things that actually impact the Black community, what are our consumption patterns and how do we capture those data? I think that goes back to the conversation I had around the qualitative data. What are things that we can do within our own locus of control, right, in our communities to capture this information? And that's, again, I would say is a call to action for all of us, both that are those that are part of the Black diaspora and also allies, because at the end of the day, Black people, and what I know from what I've seen, not just in the United States, Black people spend. And the Black dollar is powerful, right? And I think that would be something of interest to anybody in any type of business environment, the consumption patterns. In the United States, now we have big financial institutions like Bank of America, et cetera, that have made really big investments into building Black entrepreneurship. There's a reason, right? And so how do we also share this information, as you said? How do we help inform each other in terms of our practices? But I think more so is, and what you're uncovering is that there is a complex data challenge that I think exists within the Black community. And how do we create these epicenters where we're actually capturing information that's going to lead to upward mobility for Black people across the diaspora?
Excuse me, I'm going to speak in English because I would like to connect direct. Okay. My name is Jamile Cerqueira, I'm from here. I'm from Salvador. I was born here. All my family is Brazilian. Estou pedindo desculpa porque eu vou falar diretamente em inglês, tá, gente? First of all, I would like to say thank you for coming here. And I believe that is very important to us to have someone coming direct from where you came from, because your history is already ahead from ours. And I believe your experience does the same. One thing that I don't know before, I would like to say that I went to US, I studied, and I get my master's in management in the Southern Oregon University. And I had the opportunity to understand the Black History Month. I was in a university that I was also part of the BSU, Black Students Union. So now I'm 44 years old, but this was when I was 27. But I never had, it never left my mind the way you fight towards the things that you are looking at or you are pursuing. I believe we have something like that, but in somehow is kind of different. And when it goes to success, how can we break this wall that it seems here in Brazil is always there, is always there? I have been combating racism since I was born. I am privileged because as a black woman, I was born in an Afro-centered family. So there was no need to someone to say who I was. I knew already. I braided my hair since I was 3 years old, so it's not about a movement, even though I am very happy to see other people as black as I am, having that maybe 20 years after. The thing is, it doesn't matter how long, for me, it's important that that person can understand their identity. And I think here we are having this movement. But one thing that I don't know if you already know about Brazil, do you know how there is an institution called IBGE, that is a Geographic Institute, Brazilian Geographic and Statistic Institute, that make us like black, brown. I don't know if it is brown because the name that they give in Portuguese is pardo. I don't understand this. I don't know how to translate pardo in English. And I don't recognize pardo. I'm so sorry for that. So black, brown, indigenous, yellow. I understand that for the public politics is needed, but at the same time, I don't understand in how much this kind of division can help to find this kind of statistics that you are looking for. What I know is, as much black you are, less opportunities you have. For example, they have this kind of colorism. If you are dark, you are out of the better opportunities. If you are less dark, you have, even though the racism will take you in some place. For example, I'm not dark, I'm black. I'm not dark, but for example, I have 20 years trying to get inside the diplomatic career. I started when I was 20 years ago, and I have been trying. I know how to speak English. I've lived in USA. I did my master's there. It was the impact of Brazilian government into the Darfur conflict. I was there. I saw Obama won the first time. So all this environment changed my mind in a better way, but it's still here. It seems not enough to you to continue breaking these walls and take what is yours. Now I have like a company that is not like my last project, is one of my projects, but when you go up, trying to get the power, for example, I was in my embassy in Sudan, because my master's was about Sudan, and after a while, I had this opportunity. But the first opportunity that I had was from the Sudanese embassy to work in the career I would like to. It was not from my Brazilian government. And always I ask, why? And then when you go up looking for these power places, the color that you will always see is not black. So many people, when I was in Sudan working in my embassy, not as a diplomat, but I could do the work of diplomat without contract because they did not have another person. And I went with my own ways. I sold car, I sold my furniture inside but just to make the big story short, all the time people could talk to me and say, okay, you are Sudanese. I said, no, I'm Brazilian. People don't understand that this is normal to see a Brazilian that is black and, for example, can speak English or can speak French or whatever. And again, these statistics institute, for me, the first problem we have here to try to solve most of these things is that kind of division that makes many colors. And at the end, some people don't want to say they are pardo. They don't want to say they are black. They don't want to say, if they can, they will say they are white. So these are the institute who collects the data. Do you really think we will really have a sharp? I know there are some mistakes because of statistics. Usually you work with some kind of mistakes percentage. But in the whole thing, do you really think that one population that doesn't see itself as a black person, and then black or brown or yellow or whatever it is, how can we really change the structure if the people who are deciding, they are not black? So I don't know if this is a question for you, but it's at least it's like a atmosphere that doesn't go. We are always going in the same problems. People are still suffering. We are still not getting what is ours. And we have many talks that I feel is very important. Also because this makes us to release some of our fears, or sometimes we are just tired, you know? I'm sorry that just came. But I believe that we need some change in the structure that is not contributing for our progress. Thank you so much.
No, great comments, and I'm try to be mindful just because of time. You raised a few things. One is that this challenge becomes complex and even more complex, and it's very complex within the Brazilian context because you're not just talking about race, you're talking about colorism, and colorism is not formally recognized. So that's one of the issues as well. So when we talk about these data conversations, et cetera, even if there are data that are captured around race, there's nothing that's really disaggregating those data around colorism and the effects of colorism and outcomes related to colorism within specific communities, right? I think that, and you're right, this is a much deeper and longer, that is definitely a policy conversation. And I would say is that, to your point, your second point around representation, that's why it matters and why it's so important. When you lack that diversity in decision-making, when you lack diversity that is actually in those spaces when decision-making is happening, when policies are being formed and these data conversations are happening, and those blind spots are there, and you're perpetuating the same problems over and over again. But I think also equally is that for those of us that are in those spaces, the very few, often we're afraid to speak up because we don't want to lose our place in that space, if that makes sense, right? So, how do you, again, I get back to the point of what I was mentioning earlier about strategic disruption. How are you positioning yourself when you are in those spaces to be able to speak up and elevate those things because you don't want to lose your place at the table, right? So it's a very complex thing, but diverse representation matters. And honestly, and quite frankly, in my opinion, we need to have more people that represent the community and more people that are more connected to the problems in those spaces making decisions. They can't be excluded anymore. And I think that's a big issue. If you're talking about issues that relate to black people in Brazil and you don't have black people at the table that are having conversations about black issues, then how are you going to solve black problems, right? To me, it's common sense, but we see that happening over and over again, and so what happens is it perpetuates the same cycle, right? But yes, it's a policy conversation, but I think it's a more complex conversation also around colorism, and it's something that we experience as well. In the United States, I've seen colorism play out, and some of our colleagues could probably speak more better to it than myself, even in places like South Africa, but even in the United States, colorism is real. So I spend a significant amount of time in New Orleans, Louisiana, and I don't know if you've heard of the whole concept of being Creole, and this goes back to centuries. When you're talking about from a historical standpoint, you're talking about it was something that was called plissage from the French settlers. And so you had French men that moved and lived in the French Quarter and had black families on the other side of Basin Street. So you understand. And so what happened is they created this community, this Creole community of fair-skinned people. And you have people now that are in New Orleans that will say, I am not black, I'm Creole. Because there is some type of privilege associated with being closer and proximal to whiteness, right? That we don't, exactly, colorism. But the problem is that even in our society, we don't have those true conversations, I believe, enough around colorism, and we're not capturing data around it. So to your point, that's another layer and another complex problem that people in the Black community have that we have to face.
Então, é isso. Não temos.
So we don't have time for more questions. We are going to start with Yolanda. And we're going to have a journey about indigeneity and biohack. So 5 minutes to drink water and come back. Obrigada. Obrigada por sua flexibilidade. Eu vou ser honesta. Eu tinha uma apresentação, mas alguma coisa me tocou no almoço. Eu falei, não, vou conversar com o pessoal, não vou ficar apresentando, não. Eu espero que vocês tenham aprendido alguma coisa, porque eu aprendi muito com vocês hoje.